much, Deeksha, for taking time out today and joining us for this series of discussions on competition policy and strategy in digital markets. We're trying to put a lens on what strategy should be in India, given its different demographic constraints and also the level of evolution that digital businesses are at in this country. So I think a good place to start off this discussion would be by establishing the problems that you feel exist in digital markets from a competition lens, and these are problems which are perhaps unique to them and make them differ from physical businesses.
Thank you so much for having me here, Mohit. It's one of the burning issues, I think, in today's world, and there's very big need of dialogue around it. But just coming to your question on what do I think are the unique issues, personally, I feel there is nothing unique that we're seeing in digital markets. Because of the way the markets work, perhaps the way the issues or the allegations and concerns are arising is slightly different. But the basic concerns that have been raised by a lot of people are largely similar to what we have seen over the years in competition law in the traditional markets as well. So there are concerns around what will be the impact of network effects, which is not something which is new at all. We've been facing it in other industries as well. Telecommunication immediately comes to mind. There, of course, on the behavioral side, then people are raising issues about self-preferencing style claims. Again, not something new. Potential issues of leveraging. And then there is the big issue of how to look at data, how these companies can deal with data, which again, at the end of the day, is how companies are using their resources and assets. So I don't think there's a fundamental change in what problems we are seeing. It's just perhaps in a system that we are not very familiar with.
Right. So given that you believe that currently there's no unique problem as such, would you then be in favor of the kind of measures that are now common in the EU, and we're also seeing increasing evidence of in the US, which are more interventionist, also more ex ante, and sort of aimed at these particular factors that you just spoke about, which is data and other things? So would you say that those are at this stage a little premature, particularly for the Indian economy?
Absolutely. I think when you talk about something like ex-ante regulation, there is a need to be extremely careful. There is a reason why regulation is meant to be a little light touch. And that reason comes from the basic ideology that you would want companies to innovate and to work as much as possible and try and regulate them in very broad boundaries. With ex-ante regulation, the boundaries are narrowing a lot. There is an attack or a prohibition on very specified conduct, which can have, I think, a very bad impact on how companies generally innovate. And this won't just be for the companies who might be subject to all these regulations. It all flows down and trickles down to players who are smaller and are perhaps looking at ecosystems created by these companies to innovate themselves. So the entire sector is very interlaced and interlinked. And if there is heavy regulation at one point, that is bound to trickle down and the impact will be felt across. So I feel for ex-ante regulation, there is perhaps a need of much more analysis and study before conduct is prohibited without doing an evidence-based analysis.
Right. So could you elaborate a little bit on what this sort of analysis should ideally entail and what we need to do from an ecosystem perspective to understand when such measures, and also from a regulatory perspective to understand when such measures should be brought in? Like what could be those knowledge building or capacity building exercises that we undertake?
So I think part of knowledge building comes in from the currently approved regulatory practice of case-by-case assessment. And I'll speak to this only from an Indian context. The Competition Act has provisions which govern the conduct that often is talked about as being problematic. And the Commission is actually looking into a lot of this conduct. The process of looking into it involves a detailed investigation by the Commission, where we have the investigating wing of the Commission, which is the Director General, reaching out across stakeholders to collect hard data. And that data is then processed, looked into by the Commission, comments invited from various parties to arrive at a final decision, which is a form of case-by-case assessment of what these practices are, taking into account the evidence that may have emerged from the market. That, for me, provides a very good base on how to regulate companies, not just in the digital ecosystem, but across ecosystems and industries and landscapes. Because the intervention here is going to be based on review and analysis of economic evidence and of legal arguments, as opposed to being a decision taking at a prior point of time. But even if one were to think of going ahead or contemplating, and it's not bad to think about these things, right? You can always think of whether ex ante is needed or not. I think again there has to be studies, and those studies have to narrow down on various issues, including the starting point of reference being when do we enter into such kind of regulation? What industries generally merit such kind of regulations? Do digital ecosystems meet the criteria that we generally use to regulate industries on an ex ante basis? And once that base study has been completed, more narrower studies on each of the areas that might need regulation. And I think absent that, it might just be more of a instant move, which may not lead to the benefits that regulators think it might lead to.
Right. So if I understand that correctly, would it be fair to say that efforts in India towards improving competition policy and also competition adjudication need to focus more on within the constraints of state capacity on ascertaining how these businesses are functioning and whether there are indeed competition problems faced by not only consumers but other businesses as well. And it's only once we have this holistic picture should we then consider further regulations and interventionist measures.
That's not to say that the commission is restricted or the government is restricted to the commission's investigating powers. We have seen various measures taken by the Competition Commission itself, where they have initiated sector inquiries into a lot of sectors. I think those sector inquiries, again, provide a very good base for you to understand what the issues are and how those issues can best be handled. So that's a tool that needs to perhaps be used a little more before any decision on ex-ante regulation can be taken.
Right. And finally, I think just to wrap up, what do you feel from, like as a practitioner, you're familiar with academic literature that's coming out on the subject, as well as arguments that are being made in court. So having gone through this, do you feel there's a missing element, say, in Indian literature on this subject that we need to fill and requires more attention?
Definitely. I think Indian literature has not given a lot of attention to India's need and a look at all these policies from a very Indian perspective. We have been looking at what's happening in Europe, but I don't think that Indian perspective and the need of the Indian markets has made its way into academic research. I don't think that's completely missing from judgments. There is perhaps some amount of recognition within the CCI that Indian markets are different from the European markets. Indian consumers are different from the European consumers. In fact, I think we are way more advanced in our appreciation of technology to a certain extent than Europe feels that European consumers are. So I think that understanding of what the consumer mentality is, what the consumer knowledge base is, how the ecosystem and different players in the ecosystem are interacting, what are the needs felt by different players in the ecosystem, upstream and downstream. I think all of that needs to be done from an India-centric approach. And that could really feed well into how the regulator is thinking of these issues, as well as how courts think of these issues.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Deeksha. That's given me a lot of insights on competition strategy and policy for the country in general. And I hope to continue engaging with you on these issues.